bit by bit, all the old monopolies of the mercantile system were actively removed by the state. So how did this happen, and who was responsible for the triumph of liberal political economy? Unlike the textbook, you'll notice very few people actually appear in my lectures. No one is, I never point out and say, yes, she is to blame for this, or she is responsible for this. I'm trying to talk instead about general processes, but right now I'm going to just give you an example of actual people doing stuff. And I'm going to take one example, which is the Corn Laws, because it was the most contentious, and the issue of free trade. And so I'm going to talk about this organisation called the Anti-Corn Law League. Now, the Anti-Corn Law League was basically associated with the commercial interests of the new industrial bourgeoisie. When I was at school, I learned that basically the Anti-Corn Law League was the Manchester middle classes, the manufacturing classes, who were dependent on import and export markets, and they hated the aristocrats who had defended the old mercantile system and particularly profited by the operation of the Corn Laws, because what the Corn Laws did was protect British agriculture from cheaper foreign cereals. And there is some truth in that caricature. The Anti-Corn Law League, people like Cobden and Bright, became known as the Manchester School of political economy. But it's immediately a little more complicated than that, because many members of the Tory party were also deeply invested in liberal political economy. Okay? Remember, we have two political parties at the beginning of the 19th century, the Tories and the Whigs, and very soon, i.e. in the 1840s and 1850s, those parties rebrand themselves, as we now say, as the Conservative Party. The Tories become the Conservative Party, and the Whig Party becomes the Liberal Party. And basically what I'm going to be suggesting to you is that liberal political economy crushed all party differences. So let me get back to Robert Peel. Robert Peel, as I said, was on the Bullion Committee that helped establish the gold standard in, between 1816 and 1821. He was involved in Lord Liverpool's administration in the 1820s that reduced the number of, reduced the size of the Corn Laws, i.e. reduced the size of the tariff on foreign corn. They also reduced the numbers of tariffs on overseas commodities. They relaxed the Navigation Acts in 1823, and they, no, those are three good things. They helped set up the gold standard, they begin to lower tariffs, and they begin to relax the Navigation Acts. When the Corn Laws are finally repealed in 1846, they're repealed by the Conservative Party. The party that is meant to represent the interests of the landed aristocracy is the party that repeals the Corn Laws. Under, guess who, as Prime Minister? Robert Peel. It's so contentious that the Conservative Party basically splits. 112 people voted with Peel, 231 people voted against him. And many so-called liberal Tories like Peel and another future Prime Minister under the name of William Gladstone, Gladstone becomes, in the 1850s, a member of the Liberal Party. And indeed, in the late 1850s, early 1860s, becomes the dominant Prime Minister in Britain down to the 1890s. Let me just say a few words in contrast with about criticisms of what Thomas Carlyle described as the dismal science of liberal political economy. I don't want you to think that nobody has a different point of view or can imagine a different system. Clearly, one very important set of critics were those 231 members of Parliament voting against the repeal of the Corn Laws. They didn't necessarily see themselves as self-interestedly defending their own landed interests. They saw themselves very often as protecting an old mercantile system that they thought had a role to protect, to foster a certain type of social organisation, to maintain what they thought as the organic bonds of social life. And here, they met with often radical critics of liberal political economy. So, for instance, in the campaigns against the Poor Law or the campaign for factory reform, you very often have an alliance of working people with paternalist aristocrats who think that the workhouse is cruel and inhumane, and that conditions in factories are barbaric. So both the factory reform movement that developed in the 1820s and 1830s and the campaigns against the Poor Law, which begin in the mid-1830s and leads eventually to the largest political mobilisation in the 19th century, the phenomenon of Chartism, I've forgotten how I'm going to end that sentence, so I'm just going to end it. Nonetheless, it's true to say that most working people were not necessarily critics of liberal political economy per se. They were certainly critical of the establishment of the gold standard. They were certainly critical of the conditions of factories and of the operation of the Poor Law. But when Chartism emerges in the 1830s, what the Chartists are really interested in is political reform, not economic reform. They want to make the state more democratic. They want all men to have the vote. They want annual parliaments. They want a whole series of things. But nowhere in the Chartist list of demands is we want to reform, we want to stop the imposition of these new economic reforms. Now, some of them may well have believed once working people had democratic control of the state, those things would have happened, but it is, I think, significant that that is not the point of their rallying cry. There are also a whole bunch of colonial critics of this regime, which I'm going to come to when we talk about the famine, because I can see I've already spoken far too long. Last thing I want to say in this general overview then about the gospel of free trade and liberal political economy was, when did it happen? Okay, I've been talking about it being set up in the 1840s and 1850s, but in fact, there's still 700 commodities subject to duties in 1840. In 1860, there's still 400 commodities with protectionist duties upon them. It's the famous treaty between Britain and France with Richard Cobden and Chevalier in 1860 that reduces the number of protectionist tariffs down to a mere 48. So, it takes a long time for this system to develop, and almost as soon as it's developed, the great economic depression of the 1870s befalls the Euro-American world. And there is an immediate embrace of protectionist policies by almost all states apart from Britain. Britain didn't go protectionist, and it didn't go protectionist because of how deeply ingrained this set of beliefs had become. And this was hugely damaging for the British economy. The British economy had become an economy based upon importing cheaper food from overseas. The Corn Laws really had effectively began to change the state of British agriculture. By 1900, 75% of cereals were imported. But critically, Britain was an export-dependent economy. And yet it was exporting, 75% of its exports went beyond Europe. Okay, so the great saving grace for Britain in the new protectionist era that followed after the 1870s was the empire, was keeping free trade going in the empire. So the empire was absolutely critical to the operation of this free trade system for the British. And it set up a deeply unequal relationship between Britain and its colonies. So free trade was sometimes enforced by wars. The best example of that is, of course, the Opium Wars with China between 1839 and 1842. But it could also be imposed upon any number of different countries. India, again, is a great example. That Indian nationalists frequently complained that they were never given a chance to have free trade, that the British government always imposed extra duties on Indian goods and always drained India of wealth through taxation and by surcharges, that the playing field was never equal. And indeed, it wasn't meant to be, because the colonies were meant to be primarily places that would provide Britain with raw materials and export markets for its finished goods, as we will see. Oh, one last point I just have to make to go back to this. I love this. You remember the story of Peterloo, yeah, where magistrates call in the military and they violently suppress the meeting in 1819. In the 1850s, Free Trade Hall is built on the very site of the Peterloo massacre. It's a great demonstration, I think, of how free trade had become literally consolidated in the nation, and most especially in that fair city of Manchester. Right, it's 11:51, and all I've got to do is talk to you about the famine in Ireland and the Great Exhibition. Should be easy. And what I'm going to try and do to make this possible, and I would advise you all at this point just to stretch your fingers out and get comfortable, is try and use these two things to illustrate the way in which liberal political economy not only had unequal effects, but that it was also used to produce new types of good liberal individuals that would work in this new economic system. And basically, these two examples I'm going to give you, one is Malthus and the other is Smith. And the famine in Ireland is, of course, Malthus. So I'm not going to give you a whole lot about how we got to the famine. You'll remember that Ireland had been formally incorporated within the United Kingdom with the Act of Union of 1801. But you'll also remember that this followed centuries of colonisation and settlement by Anglo-Protestants in Ireland. This created Ireland in what one historian has called, I think very accurately, made it a peculiar metropolitan colony. Peculiar because it's so close and because its history is so enmeshed with the expansion of the English state. Despite the Act of Union of 1801, Ireland was systematically undeveloped. Okay? It had nowhere near the degree of economic development that had been occurring in Britain. And some of that was from a lack of investment, because it was broadly seen by the British as a backward and uncivilised place. And it was thought so in a number of ways. First, in confessional terms. Ireland was, of course, Catholic, so it was obviously uncivilised. Secondly, it was thought that Ireland had simply got left behind in the forward march of civilisation, and that they only had themselves to blame for this, because they were a barbaric people, which ties into the third reason, which was racially they were considered profoundly different. And you can see that very nicely illustrated, I think, here in the publication of this map in John Beddoes' Races of Britain, where he has an index of nigrescence to basically identify where the purest Anglo-Saxon parts of England are. You'll be delighted to know that my place of birth is just, without question, as white as it can be, and that Ireland is really as pitch black as it can be. So you could have a lead article in the Times published in 1843, 3 years before the famine broke out, saying that the Ireland and the Irish have in great measure themselves to thank for their poverty. So when the famine breaks in 1845, 1846, it's very quickly devastating. It runs basically for the best part of 6 years down to early 1851. Over 1 million people die during the famine. 2 million people emigrate. That's out of a total population of 6 million. So the Irish population is effectively halved during the course of the famine. Now for British administrators, and the key figure here is our old friend from the Northcote Trevelyan report, Charles Trevelyan, this is a blessing. It's a blessing because the Irish crisis, which is the name of the book he writes about his time as the official in the Treasury that deals with the issue of famine relief, it provides an opportunity, a divine opportunity, an act of providence, an all-wise, all-merciful act of providence, to restructure the Irish economy and people along the lines of liberal political economy. So we very often think of the famine in Ireland, and you can see this in the secondary reading and in the textbook for sure, as about, well, it's about the application of this new ideology of laissez-faire, which is so central to liberal political economy. This is a bad way of thinking about the famine in Ireland. The famine in Ireland was create a dramatic expansion of the colonial state in Ireland. It helped re-engineer the nation. It wasn't about the absence of government, it was about the precise opposite. And show this to you in a number of ways. First, of course, the flows of the free market had to be kept going. And a great example of this is the export of corn, of Irish-grown corn, out of its ports, under, of course, armed guard. This became a major issue for Irish nationalists, critics of British policy. But we also know that imports actually exceeded exports by 2 to 1 during the famine. And that a good deal of those imported foodstuffs was of Indian maize, which the Irish people found basically unedible. So the market was left to flow. Evictions followed the starvation and pauperisation. Between 1846 and 1854, 500,000 people are evicted from their houses. And so the small subsistence scale agriculture that predominated in Ireland was now going to be reformed. 500,000 homesteads were removed. Farms could now take a more commercial form, could shift more to pasture and to cereal production. Property relations and property boundaries could be redrawn. And finally came the use of relief, famine relief, as a new type of work discipline. Basically, the relief of the Irish famine was used as a tool to try and make the Irish industrious, to correct the very sin that had led to their backwardness. You can see this in three ways in the public works through to in the development of the different strategies of relief. So the first thing is public. Trevelyan comes on stream as the chief administrator in August 1846. He takes over the system of public works, which was basically enabling people to work for the state in reward for payment. But he insists two things. He insists, A, that has to be centrally coordinated by a board of works, a very Chadwickian idea, and that it had to be paid for by local taxation. So the board of works in Ireland looks actually very like the sort of poor law. So local people had to support the relief of their own local populations. But much harder than that was payment was made by piece rate. And it was made at rates that were less eligible, i.e. lower than those available in the local labour market. So you basically only got paid in accordance with the amount of work that you were able to perform. This is not a good strategy to do to a starving people. Just not a smart thing at all. But it was designed to teach men the virtues of industry and to reward their productivity. And that productivity was carefully monitored by superintendents and inspectors to make sure that no one was fiddly. Also very important here, women and children, i.e. and that children were defined as people under 9, weren't allowed to work. It was the men who had to be made to work to support the women and children. So in March 1847, 750,000 men were engaged in these types of public works, and Trevelyan claimed that they supported a further 3 million people because they were supporting women and children. Men basically emaciated under the pressure of work, and so soup kitchens were introduced to provide food only for the destitute. Only the destitute were fed free. Everybody else had to buy it, and had to buy they basically fed them gruel, like a very poor version of soup. Finally, in September 1847, because that isn't cutting it either, what they do is revise the Irish Poor Law, which you'll remember had been first introduced in 1838, 4 years after the one on the mainland. And the really important revision here, bearing in mind that the original Poor Law the new Poor Law had been designed to abolish outdoor relief, what they do with this revision is enable outdoor relief, because their workhouses that they've been busy building since 1838 weren't enough of them to contain all the people that were used. So outdoor relief was provided in return for work, and in return for menial work like the grinding of bones for fertilizer or the breaking of stones for road building. And the labour was intended to be a type of deterrent. The work was meant to be bad enough to try and deter people from taking relief. Nonetheless, by 1848, 1.5 million people were being supported by outdoor relief. And in 1849, 163 new workhouses had been built over the preceding decade to house many more. Clearly, the Irish famine is a catastrophic event, and it's also a deeply shocking one for readers on the mainland, because it's the first famine, really, that becomes a mass media event. It's the first famine where you have a mass newspaper reading public that is able to hear stories of this type of suffering. So in a very real type of way, I think one could argue that liberal political economy, the introduction of liberal political economy, helps produce a new type of humanitarian action. Indeed, if I had time, I would make this argument in some ways about the abolition of slavery also. And, very importantly, what this famine does is set up the ways in which that humanitarian action has become all too familiar to us ever since. In order to generate funds, it is the innocent suffering of women and children, not of the able-bodied men that were supposedly meant to be feeding and supporting them, that was always portrayed. What have these innocent women and children done to deserve this type of starvation? Much easier to get people's sympathy for that than it was to say, why is this man not able to find work and feed his family? The last thing I want to say about the Irish famine is, of course, the policies put in place by the British government become subject to a fierce critique by Irish nationalists. And the key figure here is John Mitchell and the publication of his The Last Conquest of Ireland, perhaps. It's not published until 1861 when he's actually living in the United States, but much of this book was published in two leading nationalist newspapers in Ireland, The Nation and The United Irishman, during 1846 and 1848, before he is charged with sedition, deported to Bermuda, I suppose there were worse places to be deported to, and then escapes over to the US, where, incidentally, he becomes a defender of the southern states in the American Civil War. The southern United States, though, opposed to precisely the types of liberal political economy that were being imposed upon in Ireland. That's the connection. The almighty